The orphan trains of the 1800s, shipped like packages across America. Imagine boarding a train without knowing where it's headed. Not for adventure, not for school. But because there's no one left who can claim you. No home, no family, only the promise, whispered by strangers in starched collars, that somewhere out west a better life is waiting. From 1854 to 1929, this was the reality for over 200,000 children across America. They were the passengers of the orphan trains, one of the largest child relocation efforts in history, shipped from cities to farms, often not as sons or daughters, but as labor. It began with Charles Loring Brace, a minister and social reformer, disturbed by the growing number of vagrant children in New York City. These street Arabs, moke as they were cruelly called, were orphans, runaways, or abandoned by families too poor to feed them. Brace believed that cities were unfit for the moral and physical health of children. His idea? Send them west, away from filth, crime, and urban decay. He founded the Children's Aid Society, which would soon become the engine behind this grand social experiment. But it was never as simple or as innocent as it seemed. Children were advertised in newspapers. Towns were alerted to arrival dates. The trains would pull into station platforms, and lines of townspeople, often in Sunday clothes, would wait to inspect the cargo. One by one, children were paraded before them. Sometimes they were given new clothes and taught to smile. Other times, they wore rags and looked too young to speak. Prospective adopters would check their teeth, their posture, their muscle tone, like livestock. Decisions were often made in minutes. A boy strong enough to lift a sack of grain? Taken. A girl quiet and obedient enough to tend to infants? Taken. These weren't legal adoptions. There were few background checks, no follow-up, no guarantees of safety or schooling. Children might be promised a warm bed and parental care, but many found themselves laboring in fields before sunrise, scrubbing floors, or raising younger children for a family that didn't consider them their own. Abuse was not uncommon. Loneliness was expected. And still, the trains kept coming. Some children were lucky. They were taken in by kind-hearted families who truly wanted to raise a child, not employ one. For these few, the orphan trains may have delivered salvation. But for others, especially older children, boys expected to plow fields and girls forced into unpaid domestic work, the experience was one of dehumanization and survival. They weren't chosen for who they were, but for what they could do. Many children were separated from siblings. They might board the same train, holding hands for dear life, only to be pulled apart in Iowa or Kansas, never to see each other again. Names were changed, birthdays forgotten, origins erased. Some children didn't even know where they were born, only where they were sent. The Children's Aid Society and its counterparts, like the New York Foundling Hospital run by Catholic nuns, maintained that they were offering these children a chance at life. And in some ways, they were. The industrial cities of the East were overflowing with poverty, disease, and exploitation. Workhouses, jails, and tenements awaited many poor children. Rural America seemed like a moral and physical refuge. But the program was built on assumptions that farm life was inherently virtuous, that strangers would act out of kindness, and that removing a child from their past would save them. Public sentiment began to shift in the early 1900s. Investigative journalists exposed cases of cruelty. Some states passed laws requiring better oversight. Religious leaders raised concerns that Catholic children were being placed in Protestant homes. The concept of child welfare evolved. The government began to take a more active role, creating juvenile courts, public welfare systems, and eventually modern foster care. By the late 1920s, the orphan train movement was winding down. The final train departed in 1929. But its legacy remains etched in the lives of the children it carried and in the very idea of what it means to care for a child. For decades, the stories of these children were buried, considered failures of memory, or just too painful to tell. But in the late 20th century, surviving writers began to speak. Their stories were recorded, and their voices, silent for so long, emerged as testaments to both endurance and injustice. Some remember singing on the trains. Others remember the fear, The silence after siblings were taken, the anxiety of being picked. Some recall kindness, meals offered by strangers, a bedroom of their own for the first time. Others remember cruelty, a life of endless chores, no schooling, punishment for speaking out. What they all share is the memory of the train, that moment when the tracks divided their lives into before and after. The orphan trains are more than a footnote. They're a mirror, a reflection of a country trying to define its responsibility to its children, through bold experiments, through error, and sometimes through heartbreak. We often celebrate the American frontier, the idea of self-made success. But these children didn't choose adventure. They were loaded onto rail cars because society didn't know what else to do with them. Even today, echoes of the orphan trains ripple through our foster systems, our adoption debates, our understanding of childhood trauma. They remind us that good intentions are not always enough, that saving a child begins with seeing them, not as labor, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person, fully human, worthy of love, stability, and remembrance. The trains are gone, the tracks remain. The harsh life inside London's Foundling Hospital. Imagine a city swelling with desperation. In 18th century London, the streets teemed with the cries of the unwanted, the poor, the starving, the discarded. Among them were infants, swaddled in rags, left on church steps, in alleyways, or simply abandoned to fate. It was this haunting reality that led to the founding of one of Britain's most ambitious and tragic institutions, the Foundling Hospital. Established in 1739 by philanthropist Thomas Coram, the Foundling Hospital was hailed as a beacon of hope. Coram, appalled by the plight of abandoned children during his 20-year campaign, secured a royal charter from King George II. With support from luminaries like composer George Friedrich Handel and painter William Hogarth, the hospital quickly rose in public favor. But behind its benevolent reputation lurked a far darker truth. The idea was noble: rescue infants from certain death and provide them with shelter, education, and moral instruction. But the scale of London's abandonment crisis overwhelmed the institution. Within days of opening, the hospital was inundated. Desperate mothers queued for hours, many forced to leave their babies in the hands of fate, relying on a random token, a ribbon, a button, a scrap of cloth, to identify their child should they ever return. To cope, the hospital instituted a lottery system. Balls of different colors were drawn: white for admission, red for a waiting list, black for rejection. But the cruel irony was that even the lucky ones often faced a future bleaker than the streets they were plucked from. Overcrowding quickly became catastrophic. Disease spread like wildfire. In the early years, especially during the 1750s, mortality rates soared, sometimes surpassing 50%. Entire nurseries were wiped out by outbreaks of measles, smallpox, and dysentery. Tiny bodies filled mass graves while administrators struggled to maintain the image of a charitable refuge. The children who did survive infancy often faced years of emotional neglect and institutional coldness. Love, affection, and parental warmth were sacrificed for routine, regulation, and survival. Nurses in the countryside fostered babies until they were 4 or 5, often several to a household. Many were neglected or poorly fed. Some died from malnutrition or abuse. When the children returned to the hospital, they entered a world of regimentation. Their hair was cut, their names changed, and uniforms stripped them of individuality. Discipline was harsh, meals were meager, and affection was rare. The institution's goal was not to nurture but to mold. Children were trained for servitude, most destined to become domestic workers, soldiers, or laborers. Punishments were strict and often physical. Speaking out of turn could result in lashes. A child caught stealing food was not only beaten but shamed in front of others. The system prized obedience above all. Crying for one's mother was a punishable offense. Despite the hardship, the Foundling Hospital attracted continued support from the public and the elite. Handel held benefit concerts, Hogarth donated paintings, and the institution grew into a symbol of enlightened philanthropy. Yet the public rarely saw what lay beneath the surface: The loneliness in the dormitories, the children who cried for mothers who never came back, the silence of mass graves. One surviving record tells the story of a girl named Eliza, who arrived at the hospital with a faded ribbon pinned to her shawl. She grew up within its walls, never knowing who had left her or why. She excelled at needlework, but was never praised. When she turned 14, she was sent into service with a wealthy family. Her records vanish after that, like so many others. For many foundlings, the only legacy left behind was a number in a register and a life of labor. Some defenders argued that in an age with few social safety nets, the hospital at least offered a chance. Without it, thousands more would have perished. But that chance came with a cost: identity erased, affection withheld, and survival never guaranteed. By the 19th century, reforms slowly took hold. Mortality rates declined and foster care oversight improved. Nutrition and hygiene standards were raised. There was a gradual shift toward recognizing the emotional needs of children. Still, the scars of its early years remain etched in history. Another child, Thomas, was left at the hospital wrapped in a coat several sizes too large, with a brass thimble tied around his wrist. He was raised with strict discipline, taught to read scripture, but not to question authority. When he reached 12, he was apprenticed to a blacksmith in a remote village. He would later write a single letter to the hospital, a short thank you for keeping him alive, though his words were lined with pain. There was no reply. The hospital had done its duty. His story, like many others, ends in silence. The tokens left behind now reside in glass cases at the museum, hundreds of them. A scrap of lace, a playing card, a coin cut in half. They were never meant to be displayed. They were meant to reunite mother and child. But the reunions rarely happened. Most mothers never returned. Some died. Some were shamed into silence. Others simply couldn't afford to take their children back. The Foundling Hospital may have begun as a symbol of compassion, but it became a mirror, reflecting the class divide, the flaws of institutional care, and the cold calculus of charity. It reminds us that history's most heartbreaking chapters are often written with the best intentions, and that the price of survival for the forgotten children of London was far higher than most will ever know. Children buried alive in Victorian workhouses, punishment for disobedience. In the shadowed heart of Victorian England, beneath the polished veneer of empire and progress, lay institutions that concealed horrors too disturbing for polite society to acknowledge. The workhouse, designed as a solution for the poor, became a crucible of suffering, where discipline eclipsed humanity and children endured punishments that defy comprehension. Workhouses were meant to house the destitute, the orphaned, the elderly, and the unemployed. But far from being sanctuaries, these institutions were ruled by a philosophy of less eligibility. Life inside was deliberately made worse than the worst-paid job outside, to deter all but the truly desperate from entering. And among the most powerless were the children, many of whom were there not by choice, but by circumstance, stripped of parents, and placed into a system that treated them as burdens rather than beings. One of the most chilling aspects of life inside these walls was the punishment regime, grim, relentless, and calculated. While beatings and starvation were common, it was the use of solitary confinement that seared itself into the memories of survivors. Children who disobeyed orders, spoke out of turn, or even cried too loudly were subjected to a torment that bordered on the medieval. They were placed in coffin-sized wooden boxes, pitch black, often underground or in cellars, where no light, no sound, and no comfort reached them. Historical records and survivor testimonies recount the terror of this punishment. Locked away in a confined box, sometimes for hours, sometimes for an entire day or more, the child's world shrank to an airless void. Some were only 6 or 7 years old. Inside, they could not sit up straight, barely had room to move, and the silence was broken only by the frantic pounding of their own heartbeat. The psychological torment was immense. Children cried until their voices broke or fell into silent terror, unable to understand what they had done wrong. Many lost their sense of time. Some lost the ability to speak for days afterward. The justification, according to the overseers, was discipline. They believed they were taming wild spirits, instilling obedience through fear. But the truth was far more disturbing. These punishments were often meted out arbitrarily, based on the mood of the matron or master. A drop plate, a whispered complaint, a refusal to eat moldy bread. These were sufficient crimes to be buried alive. And what makes these practices even more terrifying is that they were not considered illegal. There were no child protection laws to speak of. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which reorganized workhouses, did not consider the mental or emotional needs of children. Reports were ignored, complaints dismissed. In many cases, the children had no one to speak for them. They were poor, voiceless, and utterly alone. One documented case that speaks of a girl named Eliza, no more than 8, who had spoken back to the matron after being slapped. She was dragged by her hair to the punishment cell and shoved into a box nailed into the corner of the storage cellar. For 12 hours she remained in darkness, emerging barely conscious, shaking uncontrollably. She would later recount that she thought she had died and was buried. Eliza was not an anomaly. Her story mirrors countless others, forgotten children subjected to state-sanctioned cruelty. Many Victorian-era philanthropists and reformers eventually campaigned against such practices. The voices of Charles Dickens, Dr. Barnardo, and others helped shine light on the workhouse abuses, especially those involving children. But even their advocacy could not immediately undo the trauma suffered by generations. For many, the scars of the workhouse were permanent. Beyond the punishment cells, these children lived regimented lives, beginning work as early as dawn. They scrubbed floors, carried coal, and stitched uniforms for soldiers, often for 12 hours or more. Malnutrition was rampant. Illness was ignored or treated with outdated methods. Death was frequent, and when it came, it was often without ceremony. Small, unmarked graves in pauper cemeteries swallowed the lives of those the system had failed. In private letters and occasional investigations, inspectors did raise concerns about the harsh treatment, but few consequences followed. The culture of fear and silence meant that most abuses went unrecorded, invisible to those outside the iron gates. The trauma did not end with release. Many former inmates spoke of recurring nightmares, of feeling phantom walls closing in. Some were so deeply scarred they could never enter dark rooms again. Others became institutionalized, unable to function outside the rigid cruelty of the workhouse system. Victorian England, while advancing in science, industry, and empire, turned a blind eye to the horror inflicted on its own most vulnerable. Today, we look back on these punishments as barbaric. But they were real. They happened. Children were entombed in silence, punished not for violence or crime, but for being poor, scared, and human. The walls of those workhouses are gone, but the silence they forced upon those children still echoes. Let their stories not be buried with them, because remembering is the first step toward justice, and justice, even delayed by centuries, begins with truth. The industrial school scandal, when orphanages became prisons. Imagine being a child no older than 6 or 7, already marked by society as unwanted. Your parents are dead, missing, or deemed unfit. Instead of being placed in a loving home, you are sent to what's called an industrial school, a name that sounds productive, perhaps even noble. But step inside, and the illusion shatters. This wasn't school, it was a sentence. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries in Britain and Ireland, industrial schools were designed to take in children considered at risk, orphans, the poor, and those deemed troublesome. But instead of offering shelter and education, these institutions became sprawling prisons for the most vulnerable. Children were beaten into submission, starved into obedience, and worked to exhaustion under the guise of reform. At their peak, these schools were home to tens of thousands of children. Many had committed no crime at all. Poverty was enough. If a child was caught begging, skipping school, or merely being on the streets without supervision, courts could legally order their removal from society and placement into these institutions, often until they turned 16 or even 18. And once inside, the door rarely opened again. Life in industrial schools was a daily ordeal. Boys were forced into hard labor, farming, carpentry, bootmaking. Girls were consigned to endless domestic drudgery, laundering, scrubbing floors, sewing. The labor wasn't symbolic. These schools made money from the work of these children. They were, in every sense, labor camps thinly disguised as moral sanctuaries. Discipline was brutal. Beatings weren't occasional, they were routine. Children were whipped with leather straps or canes for minor infractions, speaking without permission, failing to meet quotas, even crying. Public shaming was a preferred tactic. Children were stripped, paraded, and humiliated before their peers as a deterrent. Solitary confinement in pitch-black rooms was common. In Ireland, some schools even buried children in secret graves after they died from mistreatment or malnutrition, with no names, no funerals, and no mourning. Food was scarce, and what existed was barely edible: thin porridge, moldy bread, rancid meat. Malnutrition was rampant. Medical care was non-existent. Infection, lice, tuberculosis, these were constants. And when children died, records were altered, deaths were hidden, graves went unmarked. Children were numbers, statistics, labor units, not lives. Many survivors recall the silence being worse than the noise, the silence of no kindness, no comfort, no safety. Letters home were censored or destroyed. Visits, if allowed at all, were closely monitored. Children learned early not to cry because even grief could be punished. The very institutions meant to care for children had transformed into factories of trauma. In Ireland alone, over 150 such schools operated under state and religious control. Run predominantly by Catholic orders, especially the Christian Brothers and the Sisters of Mercy, these schools became synonymous with cruelty. In Britain, similar patterns unfolded. Reformatories and industrial schools were often run by local authorities or charities with virtually no oversight. Inspectors came rarely, and when they did, administrators knew how to stage a facade of order. Punishments could be arbitrary. One boy in Artane Industrial School was beaten for smiling. Another was forced to kneel on concrete for hours until his legs bled. Girls were made to wash bloodied cloths by hand or kneel in corners with heavy books balanced on outstretched arms. They were taught not to think, not to feel, not to remember. Public shaming extended beyond the walls. Being labeled an industrial school child followed survivors into adulthood. Many carried lifelong stigma, unemployment, broken relationships, and untreated psychological wounds. Whistleblowers were rare. Teachers or nuns who spoke out risked expulsion from their orders, exile, or worse. The few journalists or investigators who uncovered abuses were often ignored or silenced. It wasn't until decades later, into the late 20th and even 21st century, that the true scale of this horror was exposed. In 2009, Ireland's Ryan Report detailed decades of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse in industrial schools. The findings were staggering. Thousands of victims, hundreds of documented cases, and institutional cover-ups at the highest levels. Britain faced similar reckonings. Survivors finally had voices. But justice came slowly and, for many, too late. Today, these buildings still stand in some places, converted, renamed, or left to rot. But their walls remember. Inside those bricks live echoes of stolen childhoods, echoing down empty corridors where laughter was once supposed to be. We often ask how such cruelty could happen in plain sight. The answer lies in power, control, and indifference. Society turned its back on the poor, the orphaned, and the inconvenient, and told itself they were being helped. What remains is a legacy not just of abuse, but of silence, of a world that looked away, of institutions built to protect but used to punish, and of children who were never meant to suffer but did, quietly, endlessly, and often invisibly. The chimney sweep tragedies, orphans forced into tiny flues. In the shadowy alleys of 18th and 19th century Britain, beneath the facade of soot-streaked rooftops and brick chimneys, a tragedy unfolded that scarred generations. It was a time when industrial cities rose skyward and every building demanded a functioning chimney. But with narrow flues and angled bends, cleaning them became a grotesque human task. Enter the smallest, most vulnerable laborers, children, some no older than 5. These were the chimney sweep boys, often orphans or children sold by desperate parents. Referred to in cold terms as apprentices, they were taken in by master sweeps who promised care, shelter, and training. What followed instead was a descent into a world of suffocating darkness, burns, abuse, and death. Forced to crawl into chimneys barely 9 inches wide, these boys were sent up naked or nearly so, with nothing but brushes and scrapers, tools often abandoned for bare hands and elbows. Their small bodies became tools themselves, their skin raw and knees bloodied from brickwork. They worked in the early hours, sometimes multiple chimneys before dawn, coughing soot, gasping for air. Sleep came on hard floors. Meals were often scraps. Many developed what became known as chimney sweeps cancer, the first industrially related cancer identified, caused by prolonged soot exposure. Their lungs blackened, their skin perpetually stained, their childhoods erased. If a boy hesitated, if fear overcame him, he might be pricked with pins or burned on the feet with hot coals to force him upward. Others were simply beaten until submission became instinct. There were accounts of children suffocating mid-climb, their cries muffled by layers of soot, dying slowly and painfully within walls of brick. When they became stuck, the master sweep might send another boy up behind to dislodge them or to retrieve the body. There was no room for mercy, only speed and obedience. The laws did little to help. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1788 set a minimum age of 8, but it wasn't enforced. Children were still sold and traded. Some families were paid mere shillings to give up their sons. Others were kidnapped. Master sweeps argued they were providing a service and claimed the children preferred the work to starvation. Even church sermons at times supported this logic, framing it as an unfortunate necessity in an industrializing world. It was not until reformers like Jonas Hanway and later Lord Shaftesbury fought relentlessly that public outcry reached Parliament. Campaigners gathered testimonies from children who had survived the climb, their voices shaky, their memories filled with trauma. There were stories of boys screaming from within chimneys, their cries silenced by stone, stories of small corpses pulled out days later. And yet the practice continued. In 1834, a new act raised the legal working age to 14. Still, it wasn't until the Chimney Sweepers Regulation Act of 1864 that the employment of children under 16 was explicitly banned. Even then, enforcement was a nightmare. Some master sweeps moved underground, hiding children from inspectors. Others bribed authorities to look away. It took the tireless efforts of inspectors, charities, and whistleblowers to begin shutting down these horrors. Meanwhile, in literature and art, the tragedy was immortalized. William Blake's haunting poem, The Chimney Sweeper, gave a voice to these children, describing their suffering as a spiritual indictment of society. Charles Kingsley's The Water Babies told the tale of a young sweep who drowned in a chimney, only to find salvation in a magical afterlife. These works didn't just mourn the lost, they fueled outrage. They revealed to the literate public what soot-covered bodies and silent deaths had long concealed. As technology advanced and chimney cleaning tools improved, the need for child labor waned. But for decades, boys had died unseen in brick tunnels. Some were buried with no names, no families, no recognition. They became ghosts of industrial progress, tiny bodies broken for the sake of warmth in wealthy drawing rooms. Each fireplace lit with clean flues may have had a child's life beneath its glow. Today, when we gaze at the romanticized rooftops of old London, it's easy to imagine stories of adventure and whimsy. But behind that imagery lies a truth far darker. The chimneys of Victorian Britain were often tombs for children, sealed in soot and silence. Every warm hearth lit in those times may have come at the cost of a young life. We remember now not just the soot-covered boys, but the system that allowed it. The blind eyes, the economic desperation, the greed, and the cold logic that sacrificed the smallest for industrial gain. Their voices were whispers in flues, but today They echo loudly as a warning of what unchecked progress can cost. History remembers the sweep boys not as workers, but as victims. Victims of a society that climbed too high, too fast, and left its children in the smoke. Oliver Twist was based on real orphans, and their lives were worse. Imagine a child no older than 9, hands trembling as he dares to ask for more, not because he's bold, but because he's starving. The scene is iconic. Oliver Twist standing in the workhouse uttering the words, "Please, sir, I want some more." We read it as fiction, but for thousands of real children in 19th century England, it wasn't drama, it was survival. And the truth? Their lives were often worse than what Dickens dared to write. Charles Dickens didn't invent Oliver Twist from fantasy, he lived it. As a boy, Dickens was forced to work in a blacking factory, pasting labels on bottles for 10 hours a day while his father rotted in a debtor's prison. That pain never left him. It shaped every word he wrote. And when he created Oliver, the fragile boy born into poverty and thrust into the brutal arms of the workhouse system, he was holding up a mirror to society and to his own past. In Victorian England, poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a sentence. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act institutionalized cruelty. Workhouses were designed to deter the poor from seeking help by making conditions inside worse than any struggle outside. Children born to widows, debtors, or the sick were viewed as burdens. They were placed in institutions where meals were meager, beds were crowded, and beatings were routine. Disease spread rapidly. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Infants often died before their names were ever recorded. Orphans were at the bottom of the social order. Seen as unworthy, unloved, and often morally corrupt just for being poor, they were treated like livestock. They didn't receive hugs or bedtime stories. They were often unnamed or called only by numbers. And many, just like Oliver, were sold into labor. Chimney sweeping, textile mills, coal mines, fields, and kitchens. Imagine a 6-year-old blackened by soot, crawling through chimneys to scrape away fire-hardened debris. Getting stuck was common. So was falling. And many never came back down alive. These weren't isolated cases. This was policy. The government paid parishes to apprentice poor children to tradesmen. But those trades weren't teaching skills. They were exploiting bodies. Girls as young as 10 were sent to laundries and kitchens where sexual abuse was rampant. Boys were whipped for working too slowly or daring to speak back. There was no oversight, no one to intervene, and if a child died under a master's care, it was chalked up to natural causes. Charles Dickens filled his novels with these hidden truths. Mr. Bumble, the cruel beetle, Fagin, who manipulates children into a life of crime. Bill Sikes, who kills without mercy. These were exaggerations only in the sense that they were fictional. The characters were composites of real men Dickens had seen and feared. The workhouse wasn't a metaphor. It was a building on every corner, one the poor dreaded more than prison. And yet, the most terrifying part of Oliver Twist is not the violence or the hunger. It's the apathy. The system functioned precisely because people allowed it to. The upper classes dismissed orphans as inevitable byproducts of moral failure. They were the children of sin, of laziness, of the unfit. Few questioned why they were hungry. Fewer still asked how they could help. Charity existed, but it was often conditional, patronizing, and cold. But Dickens did more than expose injustice. He made the world feel it. When Oliver was published in 1837, it shocked readers. They had no idea the extent of child suffering happening just blocks from their homes. Through Oliver, Dickens gave these children a voice, and slowly reforms followed. The factory acts were strengthened, public outrage grew. By the 1870s, child labor laws began to offer protections. Education became more accessible. But even as the laws changed, the scars remained. Millions of children in the 19th century lived and died with no name, no family, and no memorial. They were the real Olivers. And many never got the second chance Dickens imagined. Some became criminals. Others vanished into graveyards outside city walls. A few remarkably survived and built new lives. But all of them, every last one, carried the burden of a society that had failed to see their humanity. There are letters from the time written by children in cramped handwriting begging to be released from their placements. Testimonies collected from later in life describe nightmares, hunger, and the unshakable feeling of being disposable. These aren't just echoes of the past. They are warnings, cautionary tales about what happens when a society decides which lives are worth saving and which are worth using. Oliver Twist was a warning, a plea, a portrait of innocence crushed by indifference, and today it still echoes. Across the world, children continue to face hunger, abandonment, exploitation. They sleep in streets, they work in mines, they ask for more and are punished for it. When we revisit Dickens, we're not just reading history. We're remembering the forgotten, and we're being asked a question, again and again. What will we do with the truth now that we know? Because Oliver may have been fiction, but his hunger was real. The baby farming nightmare, how orphaned infants were murdered for profit. In the shadows of Victorian England's rapid industrial growth, beneath the smog and cobblestone civility, a dark trade flourished, one born of desperation, poverty, and neglect. It was called baby farming, and for thousands of orphaned or illegitimate infants, it was a death sentence wrapped in a promise of care. At its core, baby farming was the practice of taking in unwanted babies, often for a one-time fee from single mothers or poor families who could not afford to raise them. The mothers, shunned by society and unable to find work while caring for a child, would pay women to raise their infants as their own. But behind the locked doors of damp houses and quiet alleys, many of those caregivers had no intention of nurturing life. They saw babies as currency, and the fewer they kept alive, the more profit they made. Among the most notorious figures to emerge from this horror was Amelia Dyer. Trained as a nurse and seemingly respectable, Dyer promised to care for children for a fee, but over decades she became a monster in plain sight, starving, drugging, strangling, and drowning infants by the dozen. She operated under various aliases, moving from town to town, evading authorities while leaving behind a trail of dead children. The economic model was brutally simple. A mother would pay £5 or £10, essentially all she had, for Dyer to adopt the child and provide lifelong care. But instead of spending that money on food or clothing, Dyer often killed the baby within hours or days of receiving it, keeping the payment and moving on to the next. She even placed ads in newspapers. Married couple with no children would adopt healthy infant, terms moderate. Hundreds responded. Most never saw their babies again. Authorities were slow to act. Infant mortality was common, and the poor rarely questioned or reported suspicious deaths. Death certificates were easy to forge, and coroners were overburdened. Dyer exploited every crack in the system. Sometimes she used opium-laced syrups like Godfrey's cordial to keep babies quiet or unconscious until they passed silently in their cribs. Other times, she simply strangled them with tape and discarded their bodies in rivers or ditches. Her final undoing came in 1896 when a package was found floating in the Thames. Inside, the body of a baby girl wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The label carried an address, a rare mistake. Police traced it to Amelia Dyer. A raid on her home revealed the full scope of her crimes. Clothing from dozens of infants, adoption records written in her hand, and the stench of death hanging in the air. She confessed to at least a dozen murders, but investigators believed the real number to be in the hundreds. During her trial, witnesses recalled Dyer's cold indifference. She showed no remorse. When asked how many babies she had killed, she replied flatly, "You'll know all that soon enough." In June 1896, she was hanged at Newgate Prison. The crowd outside cheered, believing justice had finally been served. But the system that enabled her, poverty, stigma, and the lack of child protection laws, remained disturbingly intact. Amelia Dyer was not alone. She was simply the most prolific. Other baby farmers, like Margaret Waters and Amelia Sack, operated with similar cruelty, masking their deeds behind a veneer of domestic care. Waters was sentenced to death in 1870 after admitting to starving dozens of infants in her care. Sack, a trained midwife, was found guilty in 1903 after multiple bodies were discovered buried in her garden. The entire practice was a grotesque byproduct of Victorian morality. Unwed mothers were shamed and cast out. Welfare systems were nearly non-existent. And while middle-class society clung to appearances, thousands of children vanished in plain sight. Many were never registered, never mourned, and never even named. Their only crime was being born unwanted. It wasn't until public outrage reached a fever pitch that Parliament began to act. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1872 introduced limited oversight, but it took repeated scandals to force stronger measures. By the early 20th century, mandatory registration of child care providers and tighter adoption laws began to choke the baby farming industry into extinction. Inquests into some of the deaths revealed chilling details. Babies were found emaciated, their tiny limbs curled against brittle bones. Some were wrapped in rags soaked in carbolic acid to hide the smell of decay. In one case, a child had been dead for over a week before anyone even noticed. Dyer, when questioned about these horrors, never flinched. She claimed she was doing society a favor, removing unwanted burdens from the streets. The press played a critical role in shaping public opinion. Newspaper headlines screamed of the ogress of reading, branding Dyer a female Jack the Ripper. Editorials condemned the apathy of authorities and demanded reforms. For once, the silent suffering of the poor could no longer be ignored. In court, prosecutors described her house as a charnel den, a place where infants went to die. One inspector recalled seeing rows of empty bottles of laudanum and jars of baby food still sealed. There were no toys, no cradles, only silence. After her execution, the government implemented the 1908 Children's Act, marking the first time the state assumed real responsibility for child welfare. Baby farming became illegal. Orphanages faced stricter regulation. And for the first time, the rights of children began to be enshrined in law. Yet even now, the echoes of those tragedies linger. In every policy written to protect a child, there's a ghost of one who wasn't. Amelia Dyer did not act alone. She acted in a world that allowed it, a society that turned its back. And when it finally looked, it could not bear what it saw. How Victorian orphans became test subjects in medical experiments. In the hushed corners of Victorian history, where progress marched alongside cruelty, there lies a dark truth often overshadowed by tales of industry and empire. While the era brought scientific revolutions and medical advances, the cost of that progress was not always paid by willing participants. Among the most vulnerable and voiceless were the orphans, children stripped of family, status, and protection. For some, the workhouse or orphanage was not only a place of confinement, it became a laboratory. As medicine began to evolve from rudimentary practices to a more scientific discipline, doctors and researchers found themselves in need of test subjects. Ethical standards, as we know them today, were virtually non-existent. There were no institutional review boards, no consent forms, no laws preventing the use of children in trials. In fact, many believed the poor existed to serve the needs of society, whether in labor, in military service, or in the pursuit of knowledge. Orphanages provided a convenient pool of children, unquestioning, unprotected, and invisible to the upper classes. These children were considered ideal candidates for experimentation. They had no guardians to oppose procedures, no legal rights to speak of, and if they died, their deaths would not raise alarms beyond the stone walls of the institution. This set the stage for some of the most harrowing medical violations in British history. Records reveal the extent to which Victorian orphans were subjected to experimental treatments. In the realm of dentistry, children were used to test early techniques and instruments, often without anesthesia. Teeth were extracted not for necessity, but to study decay rates and alignment. One orphan recalled having 8 healthy teeth removed in a single sitting to observe the jaw's natural compensation. These procedures caused not only lifelong physical trauma, but psychological wounds as well. Infectious diseases became another field of grisly opportunity. Smallpox, cholera, typhoid, these were epidemics that terrified Victorian England. But in the name of prevention, many orphans were deliberately exposed to illnesses as part of so-called vaccine trials. In some cases, children were vaccinated with experimental formulas and then monitored in isolation to assess resistance. Others were intentionally infected to test the efficacy of new treatments. Death was an accepted outcome, deemed a worthy sacrifice for the greater good. One of the most chilling aspects of these trials was the documentation, or lack thereof. Some institutions kept meticulous notes, treating each child as a numbered case rather than a human being. Others kept no records at all, burying the evidence along with the children. In some orphanages, the mortality rate among children used for medical purposes exceeded that of the general population, yet no inquiries followed. The poor, after all, were expected to suffer. Accounts from surviving children are rare but deeply haunting. One boy, Thomas, recounted being strapped to a wooden chair while physicians examined his throat with burning chemicals meant to harden the tonsils. Another girl remembered having a mysterious salve applied to her scalp for weeks, which caused blistering and hair loss, only to be told afterward that she was helping improve future treatments for the ladies of London. Complicity extended beyond the doctors. Many administrators of orphanages believed they were participating in noble work. Some were bribed. Others genuinely believed that allowing experimentation would bring favor from wealthy benefactors or scientific societies. The children, meanwhile, were told they were lucky to be chosen, that they were helping the nation. That pain meant progress. Even in death, the exploitation did not end. Orphan bodies were sometimes dissected without ceremony or consent, their parts preserved in specimen jars or displayed in lecture halls. Museums and universities proudly kept these relics, never questioning the ethics of how they were obtained. It would take decades before society began to reckon with the cruelty masked as curiosity. As public awareness grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, voices of reform began to rise. Child advocates, journalists, and a few brave survivors called attention to the abuses. Laws began to emerge, slowly, protecting children from being used as test subjects. Consent, once an afterthought, became a foundational principle, but the children who had suffered in silence would never see justice. Today, this chapter remains largely absent from history textbooks. The image of the Victorian orphan is often romanticized. Oliver Twist, wide-eyed and hungry, dreaming of a better life. But behind the fiction lies a bleaker truth: children who were experimented on, mutilated, and discarded in the name of science. They were not given choice. They were not given care. They were used. We must remember them not as footnotes in medical history, but as warnings of what happens when progress forgets compassion. These were not failures of science. They were failures of humanity. And only by facing them can we prevent such darkness from ever returning beneath the guise of enlightenment. Their names may be lost, their graves unmarked, but their pain should never be forgotten. Every advance we enjoy today came at a cost, and for some, that cost was childhood itself. Girls in orphanages were sold into domestic slavery at age 10. At first, it was called adoption, a word filled with hope of safety, of love, of a second chance. But for thousands of orphan girls across the 19th and early 20th centuries, adoption was simply another word for bondage. From Britain to America, orphanages overflowed with abandoned and impoverished children. Some were orphans in truth, parents lost to disease, war, or poverty. Others were victims of circumstance, removed from homes deemed unfit, their fates decided by courts and institutions. And for girls especially, the future was bleak. Orphanages presented themselves as places of refuge, but behind closed doors, they operated as holding pens. By age 10, many girls were considered old enough to serve. Wealthy families, middle-class households, and even rural farmers would arrive, select a child, and sign what were often referred to as indenture agreements. These agreements promised education, care, and moral guidance. But in reality, they marked the beginning of unpaid servitude. A girl might be taken from the only home she'd ever known, handed over like property, and shipped across the country. No questions asked, no real oversight. In America, during the era of the orphan trains, this practice was rampant. While boys were often adopted to labor on farms, girls were desired for domestic work, cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, sometimes for up to 16 hours a day. The term servant was never used publicly. These were adopted daughters, but they knew better. They weren't allowed to sit at the family table. They weren't given gifts on birthdays. Some weren't even allowed to speak unless spoken to. They were punished for eating too much, for speaking out of turn, for falling behind in their work. Beatings were common. Some girls were whipped with belts or switches. Others were locked in cellars or forced to sleep on floors. And if they ran away or complained, they were sent back to the orphanage, often punished again for causing trouble. Few dared to speak up. Many didn't even understand that what was happening to them was wrong. Religious institutions played a major role. In Catholic and Protestant orphanages alike, obedience and humility were emphasized above all else. Girls were trained from a young age in the duties of a housewife, not for their own futures, but to serve others. They learned to sew, scrub, and serve in silence. Discipline was framed as godliness. Submission was salvation. In Britain, the situation mirrored America's. Workhouse orphanages regularly sent girls to wealthy families who pledged to train them in a useful occupation. The poor law system encouraged it. Fewer children meant fewer mouths to feed. Inspectors rarely followed up. Once a girl was placed, she disappeared from the public record. Some girls endured decades of servitude. Their indenture contracts lasted until they were 18 or 21. And even then, without money, education, or family connections, they had little choice but to remain in domestic service. The cycle continued. Generations of women born into nothing, taught only to serve, forgotten by history. But the worst part? Many believed they were lucky. Compared to the brutality of the orphanage or the streets, life in a wealthy home, however abusive, felt like a step up. They were clothed, fed, sheltered. To question the system meant risking everything. The abuse became normalized, buried beneath layers of shame and silence. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that the world began to reckon with these hidden histories. Survivors stepped forward. Women told stories of the families who had adopted them, only to treat them as little more than slaves. Investigations revealed the scale of the system, the complicity of churches, governments, and charitable organizations. But even now, the legacy lingers. In records, in faded photographs, in the eyes of elderly women who remember the smell of bleach and the sting of discipline. The ones who never had a childhood. The ones who grew up serving others, never allowed to dream for themselves. They were not adopted. They were taken. And the world let it happen, behind curtains of piety and paperwork. Some of these girls were only 10 years old when their lives were signed away. In the eyes of society, they were no longer children. They were hands to wash, backs to scrub floors, and eyes to watch over younger children, not their own. They were expected to smile and say thank you for the privilege. The moment they entered the doors of these homes, their names were often changed, their hair cut to uniform length, their identities stripped down to fit the mold of obedience. Many were isolated from the world outside. No schooling, no play, no affection. The ones who resisted were labeled ungrateful, disobedient, or immoral. The term fallen girl was used not for those who did wrong, but those who dared to speak up, to escape, to hope for more. If caught running away, some were publicly shamed, their heads shaved, their letters destroyed. Worse still, some were transferred to reformatories where the punishments were even more severe. These were not rare cases. Across New York, Boston, Liverpool, London, this pattern repeated endlessly. Philanthropic organizations, churches, and governments proudly reported the placement of children as a mark of progress, never admitting the cost in suffering. The systems endured because they were convenient. Cheap labor disguised as kindness. Entire generations of girls were lost in service to wealthier households that saw them not as daughters, but as tools. Even as the 20th century advanced, these stories were dismissed as exaggerated or isolated. It took decades of survivor testimony and historical investigation for the full scope to emerge. The shame these girls carried wasn't just personal, it was societal. A deep-rooted guilt that still echoes today in the way we discuss poverty, class, and the rights of children. They were children, treated as property, discarded when broken, forgotten when grown. Their stories are not fairy tales. They are warnings, and they demand to be heard. This was not care. It was captivity, sealed in silence. The Royal Philanthropic Society's brutal discipline practices. In 18th century London, amid the rise of Enlightenment ideals and the birth of charitable reform, one institution promised salvation for the city's most troubled children. The Royal Philanthropic Society, founded in 1788, was envisioned as a beacon of hope for orphaned and delinquent youth, a place to rescue, reform, and reintegrate them into society. But behind the noble facade lay a system built on fear, obedience, and a brutal philosophy of discipline. Set in St. George's Fields and later moving to Red Hill, the society attracted acclaim from aristocrats and monarchs alike. It was praised for its structure and purpose. Yet the reality inside its walls was starkly different from the philanthropic ideal. The children, many of them street urchins, pickpockets, or boys from broken homes, were not treated with kindness or compassion. They were subjected instead to harsh regimens designed to break the will and rebuild it in the image of moral obedience. From the moment they arrived, these children were stripped of individuality. They were issued uniforms, assigned numbers, and drilled in military precision. The daily routine resembled a soldier's life more than a child's upbringing. Early wake-up calls, marching in silence, and working in rigid silence across labor stations. Laughter was rare, eye contact discouraged. Defiance was met not with dialogue, but with isolation, starvation, or the whip. Corporal punishment was not just permitted, it was institutionalized. Flogging was considered a necessary corrective, carried out in front of peers as both warning and spectacle. The cane and the birch rod were tools of instruction. Even minor infractions, speaking out of turn, hesitating during drills, dropping a tool, could result in physical pain. The goal was not simply correction, but complete submission. Administrators believed that through suffering, moral character would be rebuilt from the ashes of sin. One of the more notorious punishments was solitary confinement. In cramped, lightless cells, children could be locked away for hours or even days. These periods of isolation were meant to give the child time to reflect, though they more often produced trauma. Some boys would emerge crying uncontrollably, others in silent stupor. The psychological cost of these punishments was never accounted for. In the eyes of the society, they were necessary sacrifices for moral salvation. Education was part of the program, but it too was rigid. Reading and writing were allowed, but only within tightly controlled contexts. Religious instruction dominated the curriculum. The Bible was the primary text. Every lesson reinforced the same principles: obedience, piety, silence. There was little room for joy or exploration. Creativity was discouraged. Discipline was praised above all. Vocational training was another cornerstone of the institution. The boys were assigned to trades like shoemaking, tailoring, and carpentry, not as an act of empowerment, but as a mechanism of control and productivity. These workshops functioned like factories. Children worked long hours under strict supervision. Mistakes led to punishment. Success brought no reward beyond survival. The society profited from the labor, selling goods made by children who had no say in their lives. Supporters of the Royal Philanthropic Society hailed these methods as enlightened, a way to reclaim lost children and turn them into productive citizens. But critics were not silent. Reformers like Charles Dickens and others used fiction and public addresses to decry such cruelty masquerading as charity. They argued that moral reform could not be built on terror, that children needed love, guidance, and trust, not isolation and brutality. Yet the society endured, its methods evolving slowly over time. By the late 19th century, growing scrutiny led to minor reforms, less public flogging, more structured education. But even as policies softened, the foundational philosophy of dominance remained. The institution believed that children were broken things to be fixed, not growing souls to be nurtured. The Royal Philanthropic Society's practices left long scars. Former residents carried memories of beatings, fear, and silence for life. Some spoke of nightmares well into adulthood, of mistrust in authority, and of deep emotional wounds. For every child who emerged with a skill, many more left traumatized, shaped not by education, but by survival. What makes this story especially haunting is how it was dressed in virtue. The name itself, philanthropic, implied benevolence. But behind that word was a system where pain was policy, where control outweighed care. This dissonance between image and reality is a warning that not all institutions built on good intentions stay true to their founding ideals. Today, the legacy of the Royal Philanthropic Society survives in other forms, its history often sanitized in archives and museum exhibits. But the truth remains. The children who passed through its gates lived lives shaped by fear. They were told they were being saved, while being broken, molded, and silenced. And their stories deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in charitable history, but as testimonies to the cost of discipline without compassion. Canadian Orphan Immigration Program, a one-way ticket to abuse. Imagine being torn from the only home you've ever known, not because someone is waiting for you with open arms, but because the empire has decided you're too poor to stay. Between 1869 and 1930, more than 100,000 British children, some orphans, others simply born into poverty, were shipped to Canada under the guise of charity. They were promised better lives. Instead, many found loneliness, exploitation, and an icy welcome in the vast Canadian wilderness. This is the story of the British home children, a generation of forgotten souls. It all began with good intentions, or so it was claimed. British streets were overrun with children living in slums, sleeping in alleyways, or trapped in workhouses. Philanthropic groups like Dr. Thomas Barnardo's Homes and the Catholic Church Mission sought a solution. They believed that relocating children across the ocean would offer them fresh opportunity. Canada, with its sprawling farmland and growing population, was seen as a land of promise and labor. Children were not sent to be adopted in the modern sense, they were placed. The children, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, were often dressed in uniforms and herded onto steamships. They were told to be brave. They were told they were lucky. What they weren't told was that many of them would be used as unpaid servants, farmhands, or caretakers in remote and unforgiving environments. Once they arrived, they were displayed in rural towns, much like cattle at auction. A farmer might pick out a strong boy to plow fields or a quiet girl to scrub floors. The government called it a placement. In reality, it was indentured servitude. For many, it was a nightmare. These weren't families, they were employers, and the children, already traumatized from abandonment or poverty, were thrown into back-breaking labor in harsh climates with little protection. Many were beaten, starved, or emotionally tormented. Winters in rural Canada were brutal, with sub-zero temperatures, inadequate clothing, and long isolation. There are stories of children locked in barns, forced to sleep among livestock, or punished for speaking out. Complaints, when they were made, often vanished into silence. There was almost no follow-up. The sending organizations, overwhelmed and underfunded, couldn't properly check on placements. The Canadian government largely looked the other way. Abuse was whispered about but rarely acknowledged. Children who ran away were often returned. Those who resisted were punished or sent to even more remote locations. And yet, from the outside, the program was heralded as a success, a model of imperial compassion, feeding the colonies with labor and thinning the slums back home. The reality was far more complex. While some children did find kindness and stability, the overwhelming majority lived in survival mode. They were stripped of their names, their accents mocked, their identities erased. They were told to be grateful. for food, for shelter, even for abuse. Many never saw their families again. Some died young, buried in unmarked graves far from home. Others grew up never speaking of what happened. The shame clung to them for life, and there was no going back. These children were given one-way tickets. Once in Canada, they were Canadian. Their ties to Britain, legal, emotional, cultural, were cut. Many were never told why they had been sent away. Records were lost, sealed, or destroyed. In adulthood, thousands tried to trace their origins, only to find their past wiped clean. They became ghosts in their own stories. The program didn't end because it failed. It ended because attitudes shifted. After World War I, with nationalism rising and child welfare reforms taking root, the public grew uneasy with the idea of exporting children like livestock. By 1930, the mass migrations slowed. But the silence persisted. For decades, the story of the British home children was buried, too painful, too embarrassing, too politically inconvenient to revisit. Only recently have the wounds begun to open. In Canada, descendants have uncovered diaries, letters, and faded photos. Testimonies have emerged from those who survived, men and women now elderly, still haunted by the farms, the punishments, the longing. In 2009, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued an official apology, acknowledging the suffering inflicted by the program. In Canada, September 28th is recognized as British Home Child Day, a gesture, but one that can never truly repair the past. These children were not failures. They were failed by systems, by governments, by an empire that valued cheap labor over human dignity. They were shipped like goods, sold as solutions, and discarded when they broke. But they were also survivors. Many went on to build lives, to raise families, to contribute quietly to a nation that never fully claimed them. Their legacy is not just one of pain, but of endurance. And now we remember them, not as statistics, not as charity cases, but as children who deserved love and got labor, who asked for family and were given frost, who boarded ships in hope and arrived in silence. Because sometimes the greatest tragedies wear the mask of good intention. And the kindest lies are the ones we tell ourselves to sleep at night. These weren't exports. They were children. And they never should have been sent away. The Irish workhouse system, where orphans were starved to death. In the bleakest corners of Ireland's past lies a system built not to save lives, but to manage suffering. During the Great Famine of the 1840s, when crops failed and hunger became a national plague, the workhouse system was meant to be a lifeline. Instead, for countless orphans, it became a grave. The Irish Poor Law Act of 1838 created a network of workhouses, institutions where the destitute could receive food and shelter. But from the outset, they were designed not as places of mercy, but as deterrents. Entry required the complete surrender of freedom. Families were separated, dignity stripped away, and labor demanded in return for the most basic sustenance. And when the famine struck in 1845, these already miserable places turned into death traps. At the heart of this tragedy were the children. Orphaned by disease, starvation, or eviction, thousands flooded the workhouses in search of survival. What they found was overcrowding, disease, and cruelty. Infant mortality skyrocketed. Typhus and dysentery tore through dormitories packed with straw bedding and unwashed bodies. Starving children, too weak to rise, lay in silence beside the dead. Reports from the time are harrowing. In 1847, the Board of Health investigated a workhouse in Skibbereen and found children so emaciated that their bones pressed through translucent skin. Some were covered in lice. Others lay in feces, too weak to move. One inspector wrote, "I saw no signs of life in them but their moaning." Food was meager and often inedible. A common ration consisted of watery porridge or coarse Indian meal, sometimes infested with weevils. Children were forced to work for their food, picking oakum, breaking stones, or scrubbing floors. The youngest were given tasks beyond their strength. If they refused or collapsed, they were punished. One account describes a 10-year-old girl beaten for failing to lift a full bucket of coal. The cruelty wasn't just neglect, it was policy. The workhouses were deliberately brutal to discourage dependency. Irish administrators, following British models, believed that poverty was a moral failing, and so those who sought help were treated with suspicion and disdain. In some workhouses, children were forced to walk laps around courtyards for hours. In others, orphans were made to wash the clothing of the sick and dying with no protection from infection. But the darkest rumors, whispers passed between workers, families, and even clergy, spoke of something more horrifying. The idea that children were being worked to death deliberately, their labor extracted until they expired. There were even tales, though rarely documented officially, that older children's rations were cut to feed younger, stronger ones, creating a twisted form of natural selection where survival depended on usefulness. In many ways, the workhouse was not a place for recovery, but a funnel toward death. Between 1846 and 1851, tens of thousands of children died in these institutions. In 1 year alone, more than 60% of all workhouse deaths were children under the age of 15. Some had been there for mere days. Others perished slowly, over months of silent starvation. One haunting case is that of Michael O'Sullivan, aged 9, admitted to the Tralee Workhouse in 1848 after his parents died of fever. His records show he worked 12-hour shifts in the laundry, collapsed twice, and was beaten once for speaking out of turn. He died in January 1849. The cause, exhaustion and decline. He was buried in a mass grave behind the workhouse. No marker, no ceremony, no family left to mourn him. And yet, even in the face of this cruelty, the workhouse remained the only option for many. The alternative was homelessness, starvation in the hills, or death on the roadside. Ireland's Great Famine displaced over 1 million people and killed at least another 1 million. Workhouses became overflow wards for a nation dying in slow motion. The psychological toll was just as brutal. Survivors often spoke of the silence, the absence of laughter, the mechanical routines, the constant surveillance. Children were stripped not just of food and safety, but of identity. Names were replaced with numbers. Orphans were sometimes renamed for record-keeping ease, breaking the last ties to family or heritage. Eventually, the horrors could no longer be hidden. Journalists, reformers, and some priests began exposing the truth. Illustrated newspapers published sketches of skeletal children huddled in stone corridors. Public outrage grew, but reform was slow. Even after the famine ended, the workhouses persisted, rebranded but fundamentally unchanged. Many didn't close until the 1920s. Today, the stone walls of those buildings still stand across Ireland. Some are museums, others have been repurposed. But for many, they are haunted spaces, echoing with the unheard cries of a generation lost to neglect. The Irish workhouse system did not simply fail. It punished need, it criminalized hunger, and it betrayed the very children it was supposed to save. To walk its halls now is to feel the weight of absence, the lives that should have been, the futures never lived. Their names, if known at all, survive in crumbling ledgers. Their stories must be told, because history, left unspoken, is too easily repeated. Street urchins and the ragged schools that failed them. In the fog-choked alleyways of Victorian cities, where barefoot children slept in doorways and begged for scraps beneath gas-lit lampposts, a new symbol of hope emerged. The ragged school. It was a noble idea on paper. Free education for the poor, a path out of destitution, a refuge for the city's forgotten youth. But in the harsh reality of 19th century Britain, even good intentions could become another form of suffering. Ragged schools were established to provide basic education to the most neglected members of society, street urchins, orphans, and the destitute. By the mid-1800s, London alone had tens of thousands of children surviving through petty theft, chimney sweeping, or worse. The state offered no compulsory education, and the church schools often turned these children away as unworthy. Into that gap stepped philanthropists, evangelists, and reformers with a vision. Build schools where even the ragged and unwashed could learn. But idealism quickly met the limits of funding, space, and society's disdain for the poor. Many ragged schools operated in abandoned warehouses, crumbling tenements, or church basements that stank of mildew. Desks were broken. Slates were shared. Some rooms had no windows. Class sizes reached 70 or 80, with one overwhelmed teacher, often a volunteer with no formal training. In these conditions, learning was more aspiration than achievement. Food was promised in some places, but rarely delivered. Children would walk miles barefoot through winter frost in the hope of receiving bread or porridge, only to be turned away because the pot was empty. Hygiene was a fantasy. Many came infested with lice, covered in soot or open sores, yet were expected to sit still and recite scripture. Some teachers punished them for fidgeting or sleeping, unaware or uncaring that the child hadn't eaten in days. The curriculum itself reflected the values of the age. Rather than academic instruction, many ragged schools focused on religious indoctrination. Children were taught to pray, obey, and accept their station in life. Bible verses took precedence over literacy or arithmetic, and discipline, harsh and often physical, was used to enforce compliance. Spare the rod and spoil the child was not a metaphor. It was a method used with impunity, even on children no older than 5. Survivor accounts paint a bleak picture. One former student described a room so cold in winter that ink froze in the inkwells, and children huddled together like rats to stay warm. Another recalled being locked in a cupboard as punishment for coughing during a hymn. A girl named Mary recounted how her hair was shaved to rid her of lice, and she was mocked by teachers and students alike until she stopped speaking entirely. For many, the ragged school was not a sanctuary, but another battleground in a life already defined by struggle. Worse still, some schools functioned as feeder institutions for labor. Children deemed too unruly or unteachable were sent to workhouses or factories under the guise of reform. Girls were placed into domestic servitude, boys into apprenticeships that bordered on slavery. The promise of education became a pipeline into exploitation. Some never returned from the places they were sent. Administrators often kept ledgers listing progress, but behind the numbers were children lost to disease, malnutrition, and despair. A few schools partnered with missions and charities that attempted to provide clothing or hot meals, but these efforts were rare. Most were under-resourced, understaffed, and overwhelmed by the sheer scale of urban poverty. Some classrooms were so full that children sat on the floor or stood through lessons, clinging to whatever shreds of attention they could muster through the cold and hunger. And yet, within this bleak landscape, moments of hope did flicker. Some ragged schools, backed by passionate reformers and rare donations, managed to offer real nourishment, both intellectual and physical. The Field Lane Ragged School, famously visited by Charles Dickens, was one such place. Dickens's visit inspired him to write A Christmas Carol, in which the spirits of ignorance and want take the form of children. But such exceptions were not the rule. They were islands in a sea of institutional neglect. The ragged school movement eventually gave way to broader education reforms, especially with the passing of the Elementary Education Act of 1870, which introduced compulsory schooling for all children. But by then, generations had already passed through doors that promised salvation and delivered silence, shame, or punishment instead. By the end of the century, more than 300 ragged schools had served over 300,000 children, yet only a fraction left truly educated and fewer still left healed. The myth of the ragged school as a beacon of charity persists in some histories. The reality is more complicated. These institutions did help some, but failed many more. Their story is not one of pure benevolence, but of how structural poverty, underfunding, and moral superiority can twist even the best intentions into something brutal. To truly understand the life of a Victorian street orphan, one must see the ragged school not as a classroom, but as yet another chapter in the survival of the forgotten. These children were not just poor, they were invisible. And sometimes, even when someone tried to help, the help came wrapped in suffering. We remember them not to condemn the reformers, but to confront the truth that charity without resources, education without care, and faith without empathy can become another kind of prison. Their ragged shoes left no imprint on the polished halls of history, but their pain, their hunger, and their silent resilience still echo in the foundations of the systems we take for granted today. The case of Sarah Jacob, a starving girl, turned media spectacle. She lay in a small bed in rural Wales, draped in fading quilts, her skin stretched tight over bones, her breath shallow but calm. Outside her family's farmhouse, the wind swept through Llanfihangel or Arth. Inside, Sarah Jacob was dying, and the world was watching. She was only 12. In the mid-19th century, Sarah Jacob became the center of one of the most bizarre and tragic spectacles in medical history. Known as the Welsh fasting girl, Sarah captivated newspapers and physicians alike when it was claimed she could survive without food or water for weeks, even months. To the public, she was a miracle. To doctors, a mystery. To her parents, a source of both pride and prophecy. Sarah had reportedly stopped eating at the age of 10. Her family, deeply religious and poor, believed it was divine. Soon, neighbors came to see the girl who defied biology. Then, local clergy. Then, journalists. Some brought money, others brought questions. The story spread across the British Isles. And like moths to flame, Victorian society, obsessed with purity, faith, and spectacle, couldn't look away. Physicians arrived next, skeptical but curious. In 1869, after much public debate, a team of nurses and doctors agreed to monitor Sarah around the clock. They would prove whether this girl was truly miraculous or a fraud. The watch began. Sarah was moved to a hospital bed, placed under constant surveillance. For over a week, no food passed her lips. No nourishment reached her veins. At her parents' insistence, no intervention was allowed. The medical team followed the rules. They observed, and they watched her die. Sarah Jacob died of starvation after 9 days of scientific observation. What followed was a public reckoning. The girl who had once been the subject of admiration became a symbol of horror. An investigation concluded that Sarah had likely been secretly fed by her parents before the watch began, and when that stopped, she had no reserves left to survive. Her death was slow, excruciating, and avoidable. Her parents were charged with manslaughter. But society itself stood trial. Sarah's case opened a dark window into the treatment of children, especially the poor, the rural, and the voiceless. In an era when spiritualism mingled with science and sensationalism dominated media, children were often used as vessels for belief, proof, or profit. And Sarah was not the only one. The fasting girl phenomenon had surfaced before. Girls in England, Ireland, even the United States, who claimed to live without food. Some were genuine cases of illness. Others were manipulated by family or clergymen. In all cases, these girls were praised for their piety and restraint, often compared to saints. But behind the admiration lay neglect, exploitation, and, in Sarah's case, death. The Jacob family's poverty played a role, so did their religiosity. So did the media. But the doctors, those who watched, measured, recorded, and did not intervene, became the most controversial figures of all. Their failure to act, despite the evidence of her decline, highlighted the limits of 19th century ethics. And yet no one stopped the watch. They followed protocol. They wanted proof. Sarah Jacob became evidence, at the cost of her life. Her death triggered new conversations about child welfare and medical responsibility. Laws were revisited, public opinion shifted. And for a brief moment, Britain was forced to look at how it treated its most vulnerable. Not as miracles, not as mysteries, but as children. Today, her grave lies in a quiet Welsh churchyard. The stone reads simply, "I was so young." And in those 4 words, the entire tragedy is sealed. Sarah Jacob didn't need attention. She needed protection. But Victorian society gave her fame, and then it gave her death. The fascination with Sarah's case was not a fluke. It was a symptom of an era intoxicated by spectacle. The Victorian public devoured stories of child saints, medical anomalies, and spiritual phenomena. Newspapers competed to sensationalize the latest reports. One described Sarah's complexion as angelic, another declared her a gift of the Almighty. As the frenzy grew, the lines between fact, faith, and fiction blurred completely. What should have raised alarms instead deepened curiosity. Skeptics whispered their doubts, but the louder voice was that of awe. How could a child endure such deprivation with grace? Surely, they said, it must be divine. But grace in this case was mistaken for the stillness of starvation. Her weakened body couldn't even summon the strength to protest. And the nurses tasked with watching her, educated, trained, human, chose not to interfere. Behind closed doors, debates raged. Would feeding her invalidate the study? Would intervention risk public backlash? And still the girl withered. Doctors meticulously logged her condition. Her pulse, her respiration, her silence, all noted, but no action taken. The medical notes survive to this day, clinical records of a death sentence signed by scientific detachment. When she died, her body weighed barely over 40 pounds. The inquest that followed was damning. The coroner described her as having died from a slow and painful form of manslaughter. The court called it a sacrifice to superstition. But what haunted most were not just the facts, but the faces of those who let it happen. Sarah's death marked a turning point. No longer could the medical profession remain neutral observers in the suffering of children. New guidelines were drafted. The line between observation and inaction was redrawn. Children, even those at the center of controversy, were to be seen as patients first, subjects never. Still, her legacy remained shadowed by misunderstanding. For decades, her story was told in hushed tones or buried entirely. Some still called her miraculous, others called her cursed. But the truth is simpler and more heartbreaking. Sarah Jacob was a child surrounded by adults who wanted her to be anything but. A lesson was learned, but at a terrible cost. The wind still howls through the fields of Llanfihangel ar Arth, and somewhere beneath that soil lies the body of a girl who should have grown up, who should have been protected, who should have mattered beyond her mystery. Sarah Jacob was not a prophet. She was not a miracle. She was a warning. And we must never forget her name. How Victorian orphans were criminalized just for surviving. In the cobbled streets of Victorian Britain, where the soot of factories hung in the air and poverty spread like disease, children lived, and often died, on the margins of society. These were the orphans and street kids left behind by disease, war, or abandonment, surviving as best they could in alleys, under bridges, or in the shadow of workhouses. But instead of compassion, many were met with cold legal violence. In the eyes of the Victorian justice system, their very existence was a crime. By the mid-19th century, thousands of children roamed the streets of London, Liverpool, Manchester, and other industrial cities. With no guardians, no shelter, and often no names beyond nicknames given by gangs or themselves, they begged for food, stole crusts of bread, or shined shoes for a penny. But Victorian society, obsessed with order, morality, and class control, saw these children not as victims of circumstance, but as threats to public decency. The 1824 Vagrancy Act criminalized idle and disorderly persons, and it was used liberally against children. If a boy was found sleeping in a market stall, he was arrested. If a girl begged near a church, she was jailed. If two children shared a stolen loaf of bread, they were deemed part of a criminal conspiracy. The law did not distinguish between survival and mischief. Poverty itself became evidence of guilt. Once caught, these children were thrown into adult prisons or juvenile reformatories, bleak, cold institutions where discipline was brutal and rehabilitation was a fantasy. Inside, they were whipped, starved, or forced into silence for days. The youngest inmates were as young as 6. In some cases, their only crime was not having a home. The courts treated them with a mixture of moral disdain and bureaucratic detachment. Magistrates often imposed sentences without ever hearing the child speak. If a boy had no father to defend him, he was presumed guilty. If a girl had no shoes, it was assumed she was already lost to vice. Judges and constables spoke openly about the need to break the spirit of such children lest they grow into adult criminals. And so the cycle continued, orphans criminalized for daring to survive a society that had already left them behind. Newspapers labeled them street Arabs, gutter rats, or urchins. The language dehumanized them. These weren't children anymore. They were nuisances, pests, future threats to British civility. And the public, conditioned by Victorian values of hard work and religious morality, often turned a blind eye or approved of their imprisonment. Charity was conditional. Sympathy was rare. Some children found themselves swept into industrial schools or reformatories where labor was passed off as moral education. But these places were no haven. Children woke before dawn, marched in silence, scrubbed floors, and sewed uniforms for hours on end. Discipline was enforced with lashes and solitary confinement. If they cried, they were accused of weakness. If they resisted, they were branded incorrigible. Those deemed beyond reform could be shipped abroad. Between 1869 and 1939, the British Empire sent thousands of children, many of them orphans and street kids, to Canada, Australia, and other colonies. Officials claimed this gave them a fresh start, but for many, it was exile. They were put to work on remote farms, beaten by host families, or lost forever to bureaucratic black holes. Some never saw England again. Some didn't survive the voyage. There were reformers, of course, people like Lord Shaftesbury and Dr. Barnardo, who saw these children as victims, not villains. They opened homes and schools, petitioned Parliament, and fought to change laws. Barnardo famously refused to turn away any child, coining the motto, "No destitute child ever refused admission." But for every Barnardo, there were 10 institutions ready to punish. Even within reform, surveillance and control remained central. Children were catalogued, assigned moral rankings, inspected for cleanliness and character. A slip could mean expulsion. Their lives were micromanaged by an anxious society that could not decide whether to save them or suppress them. The criminalization of Victorian orphans wasn't accidental. It was systemic. The state feared what it could not control. And nothing was more unpredictable than a starving child who learned to survive in the cracks of empire. Rather than address poverty, the government punished its symptoms. Rather than build shelters, they built prisons. These children left behind few records. Most didn't write letters, many couldn't write at all. Their stories survive in court documents, in hospital registries, in the yellowing pages of police logs. But each name, each petty charge, each jail sentence tells a deeper story. Of children trying to live while the world looked away. When we read about Victorian values, about empire, progress, and discipline, we must also read between the lines. There were children sleeping beneath those polished stone buildings, children whipped for stealing a crust, children jailed for crying too loud. These weren't wayward souls. They were survivors of a cold, mechanical system that had no place for mercy. Today, we look back and mourn what was done in the name of law and order. But remembrance must come with recognition that systems of control still linger, that some children are still punished for poverty, for circumstance, for being born on the wrong side of society. The ghost of the Victorian orphan walks beside us still, asking not for pity, but for justice. The crippled orphans who were hidden from public view. Imagine a child with a twisted spine, a missing limb, or a stutter so deep it traps their voice inside. Now imagine that child being quietly removed, taken not into care, but into hiding. Not because they were dangerous, but because they made society uncomfortable. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, disabled orphans were not simply abandoned by families, they were erased by institutions. Deemed burdens, they were locked away in asylums, almshouses, and charity homes where few ever visited and even fewer returned. In Victorian England, industrial cities swelled with the poor. Disease, accidents, and malnutrition produced waves of children with disabilities. Some born that way, others made so by the brutal conditions of factory labor and urban life. If a child was orphaned and disabled, their fate was often sealed. Unlike able-bodied children who might be placed in workhouses, sold into service, or sent on orphan trains, These children were considered unfit for labor and unworthy of adoption. They were placed in confinement not to heal, but to be forgotten. Charity houses were not havens. Many were hellish. Children labeled crippled, imbecilic, or feeble-minded were grouped together regardless of their actual conditions. Crippled children with polio shared cells with children with epilepsy, speech disorders, or emotional trauma. There was no medical nuance, just containment. They were washed on cold stone floors, confined to wooden beds with straps, and denied education. To be visible was to be a shame. To be hidden was survival. In some institutions, visitors were allowed, but only if the children were hidden. Certain homes would move disabled orphans to backrooms or basements when donors or religious groups toured the premises. Others used them for pity, parading them out to evoke donations, only to return them to filth and neglect once the money was secured. Their lives were not measured in progress or potential, but in how much sympathy they could extract from a public that would rather not see them at all. Some were experimented on. Medical students, often unregulated, practiced surgeries and therapies on disabled orphans, treating them as test subjects because no family would protest. Orthopedic hospitals were known to perform painful bone and joint procedures without anesthesia. Others endured electroshock treatments, forced feedings, or isolations meant to tame unruly behavior that was actually trauma or neurological difference. Children who resisted were often labeled insane. Silence surrounded them. There were no photographs, no school records. Many had their names changed or erased entirely. A child might enter an institution at 5 and never leave. Burial records show hundreds who died unnamed, listed only by their diagnosis or intake number. For many, their lives began and ended in the same room, never touched by affection, never called beautiful, never read a story or sung a lullaby. And yet, in rare moments, stories of rebellion flicker through the records. One girl in a Liverpool asylum reportedly taught herself to write using chalk stolen from a nurse. A boy in New York, unable to speak, fashioned a crude form of sign language with fellow inmates. Their spirits refused to be entirely broken, but their world gave them no future. The stigma ran deep. Even in the early 20th century, newspapers reported on crippled children as tragic spectacles. They were rarely given voices, only described, twisted limbs, vacant eyes, deformed. The language dehumanized them so thoroughly that readers felt sorrow, but never responsibility. Disabled orphans were not seen as children to be loved, but as broken puzzles to be pitied or ignored. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that reform began. Advocates like Dr. Ludwig Guttmann, who later pioneered the Paralympics, began to challenge the perception of disabled children as hopeless. Slowly, special education programs, therapy models, and rights-based language emerged. But even then, institutionalization continued. As late as the 1960s and 70s, many Western nations still housed disabled orphans in overcrowded, understaffed facilities where abuse and neglect were routine. Today, survivors are finally speaking. Some recall the smell of disinfectant and damp sheets. Others remember the silence, that aching, endless silence when no one came for them. Their testimonies reveal not just pain, but endurance. They grew up in places designed to forget them, and yet they remember everything. The world failed them. It built walls around them. It called them defective, burdensome, less than human. But history owes them more than an apology. It owes them remembrance. Because behind every cold diagnosis was a child who wanted to be held, who laughed when tickled, who dreamed of being more than a label. They were tucked away in shadows because to look at them was to confront something society feared most: vulnerability without utility. These children didn't fit the narrative of cheerful adoption or redemptive labor. They couldn't work fields or sweep chimneys. So they were warehoused, out of sight, out of mind. And yet, in their isolation, they bore witness to the cruelty masked as charity, to the lies written into policies, and to the quiet hope that someone, someday, might see them as whole. Now we must look back, not with horror alone, but with responsibility, to tell their stories, to learn their names, to undo their erasure. Because history did not simply forget them, we chose to forget, but they never forgot what it was like to wait and be seen by no one. St. Vincent's industrial school scandal in Ireland, hidden behind stone walls and the iron gates of so-called sanctuaries, Ireland's darkest secrets once wore the mask of salvation. From the 19th century onward, St. Vincent's Industrial School, run by the Christian Brothers, promised to care for orphaned and troubled boys. Instead, it became a place of cruelty, silence, and institutional betrayal. Industrial schools were meant to reform and educate destitute children, offering structure and opportunity. But many quickly devolved into prisons for the innocent. At St. Vincent's, boys as young as 6 were committed by courts, parishes, or families who believed they had no other option. Once inside, they vanished from public life, erased, isolated, and subjected to unspeakable torment under the guise of Catholic discipline. Survivors later described years of daily violence, beatings with leather straps, starvation as punishment, and psychological torment so routine it became a part of the school's culture. Children were forced into silence. They were told that God watched their every move, but so did their abusers. Brotherhood, they were taught, meant obedience, even when that obedience meant enduring torture. The Christian Brothers wielded power without oversight. Publicly, they were revered as educators and moral guides. But privately, a culture of secrecy enabled systemic abuse to flourish. When allegations surfaced, they were not investigated. They were buried. Records were altered, whistleblowers silenced, and offenders quietly transferred to other institutions where they continued their patterns of cruelty. Some boys tried to escape. Many were caught and returned, where punishments became spectacles. Others disappeared entirely, their fates undocumented. Hunger was a constant companion. Warmth was rare. Children were denied education, forced instead into hard labor, farming, construction, laundry work, while the institution profited from their unpaid toil. The psychological scars ran deeper than the bruises. Survivors have described lifelong trauma, fear of authority, shattered trust, night terrors, and suicide attempts. And yet, for over a century, the truth remained buried under layers of clerical power and public denial. It wasn't until the late 20th century that cracks in the silence began to widen. Brave survivors, often dismissed or shamed, began to speak out. Their testimonies were eerily similar. Names changed, details shifted, but the pattern remained. It wasn't just individual abuse, it was systemic, institutional, routine. The Irish government launched investigations, culminating in the Ryan Report of 2009, a document that would shock the world. The report chronicled decades of abuse across Catholic-run institutions, including St. Vincent's. It revealed that the Christian Brothers had known about the crimes. They had protected the perpetrators, and they had failed to protect the children entrusted to their care. Financial settlements were offered. Apologies were issued. But for many survivors, no amount of money could erase what had been done. What they wanted was acknowledgement, accountability, and for their stolen childhoods to be remembered, not erased. One survivor described being locked in a dark cell for 3 days after wetting the bed. Another recalled being pulled from his bunk at night, marched down a hallway, and assaulted by a man whose name he never learned, but whose face he could never forget. These were not isolated incidents. They were a culture disguised as compassion. St. Vincent's is now closed. The buildings remain, some converted, others abandoned. But the air around them carries a weight, a silence thick with memory. The echoes of crying boys still haunt the dormitories where no prayers could save them. What makes this history so devastating is not only the cruelty, but the betrayal. The church, a symbol of faith and comfort for millions, became a machine of repression. The state, too, turned away, allowing religious institutions to operate unchecked, with legal authority and moral impunity. One of the more haunting realities is how these institutions shape generations of broken men. Many who left St. Vincent's were never able to form stable relationships, haunted by guilt and shame they never deserved. Some turned to alcohol or crime. Others vanished into silence, carrying their trauma alone. For them, the abuse didn't end at the gates. It followed them into adulthood, parenting, and even old age. Testimonies collected decades later often began the same way. "I've never told anyone this before." The culture of secrecy was so complete, so enforced, that even after the walls had crumbled, many survivors struggled to believe their pain mattered. In therapy sessions, court hearings, and truth commissions, their words emerged slowly, fractured memories held together by courage. And yet, despite the revelations, many of the abusers lived out their lives in peace, some still within church institutions, shielded by vows and hierarchy. Very few faced criminal trials. Even fewer were convicted. For survivors, justice often felt symbolic. Too little, too late. Still, their voices have reshaped Ireland. They forced a nation to reckon with its reverence for religious authority. They rewrote the narrative of institutions once idealized, and they exposed how power, unchecked and sanctified, can become indistinguishable from evil. To speak of St. Vincent's today is not to dwell in the past, but to warn the future. Because cruelty cloaked in virtue is not just a historical danger, it is a recurring human flaw. And if we forget the boys who were silenced, we risk becoming silent again. The shoe-black brigades, orphans exploited as cheap labor. In the grimy heart of Victorian England, amid soot-covered streets and the unending clatter of horse-drawn carts, a peculiar sight became common: the shoe-black brigade. To the unknowing eye, they were just boys in tattered uniforms polishing boots for pennies. But behind the brushes and rags was a system that disguised exploitation as opportunity, a society that applauded its own charity while shackling orphans to labor under the guise of reform. The shoe-black brigades were introduced in the mid-19th century as part of a philanthropic movement meant to reform street children through work. These were mostly orphaned or abandoned boys, drawn from workhouses, ragged schools, or the alleys where they slept. Rather than beg or steal, they were given boxes, brushes, and blacking paste, and put to work on corners, train stations, and marketplaces. The public praised it as a moral triumph. In reality, it was a calculated method of cheap labor. Boys as young as 6 were enlisted. They were expected to shine shoes from sunrise until nightfall, no matter the weather. Bitter wind, driving rain, or summer heat, it didn't matter. They stood for hours, inhaling fumes from polish, shouting for customers, hoping for tips they often never kept. Many suffered from chilblains, frostbite, or sunstroke. Their fingers cracked and bled, but they pressed on because hunger was worse. And if they failed to meet their daily quotas, punishments followed: food withheld, beatings administered, or expulsion back into homelessness. Some shoe-black brigades were affiliated with charities and religious missions, which offered shelter or Bible lessons in exchange for obedience and performance. But these institutions were often overcrowded and poorly funded. The earn-your-keep model meant boys had to work to justify even the most meager comforts. Failure was framed as moral weakness. Speaking to customers too casually, lingering too long, or looking disrespectful could result in public scolding, or worse, arrest. Yes, arrest. These children operated under strict regulations.
In many cities, local laws governed where and how they could work. Boys who shouted too loudly, blocked walkways, or engaged in street chatter could be detained. Some were jailed for simply trying to earn a crust of bread. Police viewed them as nuisances, despite their sanctioned role. To be a shoe-black was to walk a tightrope, visible but voiceless, hard-working yet disposable. And then there were the supervisors, often adults who took a portion of the boys' earnings. Some ran the brigades like businesses, skimming profits and enforcing discipline with an iron hand. The promise of reform masked a reality of control. The children had no unions, no advocates, and few choices. It was shine boots or starve, and sometimes even shining boots wasn't enough. Survivor accounts speak volumes. One former shoe-black named Henry recalled being forced to work 12 hours straight with no lunch break, only to have his coins seized by his overseer. Another boy, aged 8, was beaten for scratching a gentleman's boots with a brush worn to the wood. Many simply vanished, runaways, victims of illness, or absorbed into harsher forms of labor. The streets did not forgive weakness, and the system did not offer second chances. Conditions varied depending on the city and the overseeing charity. In some cases, uniforms were provided: a thin coat, a cap, and worn-out shoes, meant to give the appearance of dignity. But appearances were deceiving. Behind the clean buttons and polished shoes stood children exhausted from labor, punished for being poor, and trained to smile through suffering. They were taught not only how to scrub, but how to bow, how to lower their eyes, how to apologize for existing. Newspapers of the time often romanticized the brigades, printing glowing accounts of reformed boys, of ragged urchins turned upright citizens. Photographs showed lines of smiling children with boxes in hand, neatly dressed for the camera, scrubbed clean for a single frame. What these images didn't show were the bruises, the hunger, the exhaustion. They didn't show the cold mornings, the silent tears, the fear of saying the wrong thing to a gentleman in a top hat. Some boys did rise from the ranks, granted apprenticeships or odd jobs by sympathetic patrons, but these were exceptions, not expectations. For most, the shoeblack life was a purgatory, too poor to escape, too visible to hide, too young to resist. They existed in a limbo between reform and exploitation, dressed in uniforms of good intention, but bound by the same chains of poverty. And when night fell, those who had not earned enough to stay in a hostel would return to the streets, curling up in stairwells or under bridges, their brushes clutched like talismans, their hands stained black with polish, their dreams no longer about rescue, but about warmth and bread and rest. The shoeblack brigades are often remembered as a quaint Victorian solution to juvenile delinquency, but behind every brushstroke was a story of survival, of children made to labor for dignity they were rarely afforded. They were not just shining boots, they were scrubbing their own humanity back into a society that had wiped it away. Today, we must remember them not as curiosities, but as cautionary tales. Their small hands carried the weight of a system that expected gratitude in exchange for endurance. They deserved more than blacked boots and bowed heads. They deserved childhoods. Their stories are scuffed and half erased, like the shoes they polished. But if you look closely, the shine they left behind still reflects the truth.
When orphan boys were sent to sea at age 12, in the cold gray waters of the British coast, massive wooden training ships once rocked gently in harbor, silent, imposing, and filled with boys who had nowhere else to go. They were orphans, cast-offs, paupers, and they had just been conscripted into the sea. It was the 19th century. Britain's empire was vast, and so was its appetite for sailors. But while the merchant and naval fleets demanded manpower, the streets of London, Liverpool, and Glasgow overflowed with orphaned and abandoned boys. Many were homeless, caught pickpocketing or begging, sentenced not to prison, but to something more insidious: life aboard a maritime training ship. These were not ships that sailed. They were anchored hulks, old naval vessels stripped of their former glory and repurposed into floating institutions. Boys as young as 12 were sent to live on them. To the outside world, this was reform, discipline, a chance to learn trade and earn a future. But to those aboard, it was punishment in another uniform: the HMS Goliath, the Arethusa, the Indefatigable. Their names echoed like legends, but their decks held a crueler truth: cramped quarters, freezing winds, hard labor, and brutal hierarchy. Each boy was awakened at dawn by the shrill call of a bosun's whistle. They scrubbed decks until their fingers bled, drilled for hours, ate maggoty biscuits and watery gruel. Diseases spread fast in those conditions: tuberculosis, cholera, pneumonia. The ships were cold, damp, and unsanitary, and they were dangerous. Some boys drowned during lifeboat drills. Others were beaten to death under the guise of discipline. There were few inspections, fewer rules, and almost no mercy. The justification? These boys were to be made men, toughened, molded, stripped of their past, and refitted for empire. They were taught seamanship, knots, compass reading, naval drills, but rarely treated as human beings. Punishments were public. Floggings with ropes. Isolation in dark below-deck compartments. Bread and water rations for days. Some never emerged again. They were told it was for their own good. One report from the 1870s describes a boy, age 13, who jumped overboard in desperation. He couldn't swim. He didn't want to. Death was quieter than life on the ship. Others tried to run away, only to be caught and returned, punished before the eyes of their shipmates. And yet this system was praised. Parliament hailed it as a success. Charities boasted of turning vagabonds into sailors. Parents who couldn't care for their children sometimes volunteered them into these programs, hoping the Navy would feed them when they could not. The line between rescue and abandonment vanished in the salt spray. There were, of course, success stories. Boys who survived, who rose through the ranks, who saw the world from a ship's deck instead of a prison cell. But for every survivor, there were dozens broken, scarred, lost to disease, violence, or the waves themselves. The British Admiralty eventually expanded the model. More ships, more boys, more discipline. It became a template exported to colonies, Australia, Canada, even India. Orphan boys, rebranded as naval cadets, were no longer just abandoned children. They were empire's cheapest fuel. Reformers raised alarms, but their voices were drowned out by the sound of polished boots and patriotic speeches. Who would question the empire's need? Who would listen to the poor? By the early 20th century, the tide began to turn. Investigations revealed deaths, abuse, and systemic failures. Ships were decommissioned. Boys were returned to shore-based schools. But the trauma remained. The boys who had been shaped by waves and whips returned to land as men, but hollow, angry, or lost. To understand how such a system was allowed to flourish, one must look at the Victorian obsession with order and empire. Society prized obedience over compassion, labor over childhood. The sea, vast and merciless, became both a dumping ground and a testing ground. Boys who had no homes were told to earn their worth in salt and sweat. The training ships were a paradox, seen as both salvation and sentence. Recruitment posters promised adventure and respectability. But the boys who boarded rarely returned with dreams intact. Many had never seen the ocean before. They were marched up gangplanks with their few belongings bundled under their arms. Most had never held a compass, much less known what it meant to navigate the world. Discipline was harsh because it was meant to erase the past. Many of these boys came from broken homes, from workhouses, from the alleyways of industrial cities. Their accents, scars, and traumas were viewed as impurities to be scrubbed away. The naval system didn't rehabilitate, it reshaped, but not always for the better. Bullying was endemic. Senior boys, granted authority, often became cruel enforcers. Fights broke out in cramped quarters, injuries went untreated. And worse, some accounts tell of older crew members preying on younger boys, a hidden epidemic of abuse, silenced by shame and fear. With little oversight and vast deference to naval authority, justice was almost impossible. Despite all this, the ships were kept full, because for the state, it was a solution. It cleaned the streets, it fed the fleets. It gave the illusion of charity wrapped in brass buttons and polished shoes. By the time reforms came, spurred by whistleblowers, bereaved mothers, and investigative journalists, it was too late for thousands. The trauma of those who survived often lasted a lifetime. Nightmares of drowning drills, screams in stormy dark, the snap of rope on skin. Some never spoke of it again. Others tried and were met with disbelief. Now the legacy floats only in fragments. A brass nameplate in a museum, a grainy photo of boys in sailor caps, a weathered journal from a captain who thought he was doing good. But the real story lies in what those ships buried. Voices unheard, childhoods erased, lives broken. They were promised discipline. They received despair. And yet they sailed on, carrying the weight of an empire that saw them not as boys, but as bodies for the mast. Let history not forget, the sea did not make them orphans, but it finished the job. Victorian orphans in Australia's penal colonies. In the 19th century, under the shroud of imperial benevolence, Britain shipped thousands of its orphaned and unwanted children to the farthest reaches of its empire, Australia. Marketed as a chance for a better life, this forced migration program was, for many, a continuation of cruelty. What began as social reform quickly devolved into exile, labor exploitation, and systemic abuse. Victorian orphans became colonial tools, malleable, disposable, and largely forgotten. The roots of this relocation effort go back to Britain's overcrowded cities and rising fear of the dangerous classes, poor children loitering in the streets, stealing bread, or begging in gutters. Institutions like the workhouses and reformatories overflowed with youth deemed incorrigible or burdensome. Instead of rehabilitating them at home, Britain saw opportunity in its colonies. Australia, with its vast land and labor shortages, was framed as a solution. Between the 1830s and early 20th century, over 100,000 children, many of them orphans, some as young as 4, were sent across the world under child migration schemes. They traveled alone, without parents or protections, under vague promises of education and care. But these children were not welcomed as future citizens. They were treated as indentured laborers, cheap workers for farms, orphanages, and institutions in Australia's harsh interior. Most were placed in remote industrial schools or homes run by religious orders or state authorities. These were not homes in the comforting sense. They were regimented, militarized compounds where discipline replaced nurturing. Children were woken before dawn, forced into agricultural labor, often under brutal conditions. Education was minimal, personal freedom non-existent. Corporal punishment was routine. Children were flogged for disobedience, beaten for not working fast enough, locked in dark cells for crying. Letters home, if they could write, were censored or never sent. Many were given new names, stripping them of identity. Some were told their parents were dead, even when they were not. The goal was assimilation, obedience, and silence. Girls were particularly vulnerable. Many were placed as domestic servants with settler families, where they endured isolation and, in countless cases, sexual abuse. With no guardians to report to and no oversight from Britain, these girls vanished into rural servitude. Some ran away, some took their own lives. Few were believed when they tried to speak out. Boys fared no better. They were assigned to sheep farms, timber mills, or construction crews, places with little patience for youth or trauma. Physical abuse was endemic. Labor was relentless. If they complained, they were labeled ungrateful. If they rebelled, they were punished severely. Australia's institutions became, in essence, open-air prisons for Britain's forgotten children. The British government praised the schemes publicly, framing them as acts of salvation. Reports celebrated how delinquent boys had become industrious men, how fallen girls were reformed through hard work, but the reality was rarely inspected. Most inspection tours were brief, announced, and symbolic. The abuses continued behind closed gates, far from cities, far from England's scrutiny. Many of these children never returned. The ocean was not just distance, it was erasure. Ties to family, language, and memory were severed. Some children had living parents back in Britain, unaware of what had been done. Others grew up believing they had no one. In truth, many were taken not because they were truly orphans, but because they were poor. By the early 20th century, as scrutiny grew, the child migration programs began to fade, but they never truly disappeared. Similar schemes persisted into the 1950s, sending more children from post-war Britain to Australian institutions. The suffering continued across generations. It wasn't until decades later, into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, that survivors began to speak out en masse. Their stories were harrowing. They spoke of rape, of forced labor, of emotional torment. They demanded recognition, apologies, and justice. Some turned to the press, others to courts. In 2009, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued a formal apology to the forgotten Australians, acknowledging the cruelty inflicted on these children. The UK followed with its own apology. But no amount of words could undo what had been done. Lives were reshaped, Families lost, identities erased. Trauma echoed through generations. Some survivors reunited with long-lost siblings. Others died still searching. The scars of imperial child relocation are permanent, even as governments try to bury the past in archives and ceremonial statements. The story of Victorian orphans in Australia is not just a colonial footnote. It is a chilling reminder of how systems of power can disguise cruelty as charity. These children were not rescued. They were repurposed. Their voices were not heard. They were silenced. And the legacy of their suffering remains etched into the soil of 2 continents. Today, when we speak of empire, migration, or reform, we must remember these lives, not as statistics but as individuals. Each name lost in a ledger, each child torn from home, was a human being forced into exile, not for their crimes, but for their vulnerability. And that truth must be spoken aloud again and again until history listens.